Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive today. And today we're really getting into it with David Lane's Why I Don't Eat Faces. um, it's a pretty provocative title. And the excerpt we're looking at digs deep into the arguments for vegetarianism. And I got to say, Lane doesn't really sugarcoat anything.
Mhm.
He blends personal stories with philosophical arguments
Right.
and even throws in some wild scenarios that'll really make you think. So get ready to explore the logic behind his arguments and maybe even uncover a few holes in his reasoning.
It's really fascinating how Lane starts with his personal journey. He takes us all the way back to his teenage years, like when he first decided to go vegetarian for health reasons. But it was actually something his brother said that really cemented his commitment to
How
it.
do you mean at the part where his brother catches him snacking on chicken skin after he swore off meat?
Exactly.
It's kind of funny, but it shows how just a simple comment can totally change the way someone thinks about food.
Right. It's like those small moments can have such a big impact on our choices. But Lane doesn't just stop at the personal level. He goes on to develop what he calls a neurophilosophical argument.
The neurophilosophical.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of us who haven't brushed up on our philosophy lately, can you break down this whole neurophilosophy thing?
Sure. So basically, it all comes down to the central nervous system. It's this complex network of nerves that carries messages throughout the body. It controls our senses, our movements, and how we feel pain. And Lane's argument is that animals with a similar nervous system structure, they probably experience pain in a way that's similar to us humans.
So he's saying that if we don't need to eat animals to survive, then why cause them pain? It
Yeah.
really makes you think about the ethics of it all.
Yeah, that's exactly the point he's trying to make. Like, why are we doing this if we don't have to? Especially when there are so many plant-based options available. And to really hammer it home, he introduces this thought experiment. Imagine a species, he calls them transhumans, and they're way more intelligent than us, and they've decided that eating humans is okay because they don't think we experience pain on their level.
Whoa. Oh, yeah, that's a pretty disturbing thought. It's like flipping the script on our whole relationship with animals. So how would we even argue against being eaten in that situation?
Right. It's a question that forces us to confront our own biases. Like, if we wouldn't want to be treated that way, shouldn't we extend the same consideration to other species?
It definitely makes you question things. But Lane doesn't just rely on logic. He also uses some pretty vivid imagery to get his point across.
You're talking about those kind of intense scenarios he describes, right? Like the one about kissing a cow's tongue or
Yes.
stabbing a live cow to get a steak.
Now those, I have to admit, they're a little jarring. Is he trying to shock us into changing our minds?
I wouldn't say shock, but he's definitely trying to break through those mental barriers we've built around eating meat. We usually see it all packaged up neatly at the grocery store, totally disconnected from the animal it came from. And Lane wants us to confront that reality head on.
It's like he's saying we've become desensitized to the whole process.
Exactly. We use words like beef and pork instead of acknowledging that it came from a living creature. Lane's descriptions are meant to make us face that connection, to see the individual animal behind the food.
I'll say it's definitely an effective way to grab your attention. But it's not just emotional appeals he uses. Lane also brings in some pretty big names to back up his argument.
You're right. He quotes both Einstein and Tolstoy, both known for their intellect and compassion, and both advocating for vegetarianism.
Interesting. So he's combining personal experience, philosophical arguments, and emotional appeals, and he's backing it all up with perspectives from influential figures.
It's a multi-layered approach. And I think that's what makes his writing so compelling. He really wants us to examine those deeply ingrained beliefs we have about food and the animals we consume.
And he's not afraid to be controversial either. He even compares the unthinking acceptance of eating meat to the horrors of the Holocaust. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. It's definitely a comparison that can evoke strong reactions. It's important to approach it with sensitivity. Lane isn't saying the two are directly equivalent, but he's drawing a parallel to show how societal norms can blind us to suffering, whether it's human or animal suffering.
So he's trying to make us think about how we can become complicit in harmful systems if we just accept the status quo without questioning it. It's a heavy comparison, but it definitely makes you think.
Absolutely. It pushes us to examine our own roles and choices within larger systems. And to be fair, Lane acknowledges that there might be situations where eating meat is necessary, but he really emphasizes the abundance of plant-based options we have today.
That's a good point. He's not saying it's black and white.
Mm-hmm.
He's presenting a perspective and encouraging us to think critically about our own choices.
Exactly. And he even goes on to address counter-arguments to his views, including one from a reader who was really upset about the Holocaust comparison.
Hmm. I can understand why someone might be upset by that.
Yeah, the reader called it offensive. And Lane's response is worth noting. He says that valuing animal life doesn't have to diminish the value of human life. Instead, he sees it as broadening our sense of compassion.
That's an important distinction. He's not saying one form of life is more important than another, but rather that we can expand our empathy to include all living beings.
He's advocating for a more expansive view of ethics and compassion.
He's really challenging us to think about how our choices affect the world around us. This is getting pretty deep.
He brings up Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate. He was a huge advocate for animal testing.
Oh yeah, I know Crick from his work on DNA, but I haven't really looked into his views on animal testing. What's Lane's take on it?
Well, Lane basically points out what he sees as hypocrisy in Crick's stance. Crick was all about humane treatment of animals, but at the same time, he supported using them in experiments that could cause pain and suffering.
So Lane's saying that Crick wanted to have it both ways, advocating for ethical treatment, but then justifying practices that inflict harm.
Exactly. He's calling for consistency in our values. If we believe in treating animals humanely, shouldn't that apply across the board, whether it's for food research or anything else?
Yeah, it's a tough question for sure. And it brings up that whole debate about the necessity of animal testing for scientific advancements.
Right. Lane doesn't give us easy answers, but he forces us to grapple with these really difficult ethical dilemmas. It's not about condemning anyone, but encouraging a deeper reflection on our actions and the reasons behind them.
It's like he's saying, hey, let's not just blindly accept things. Let's really think about the consequences of our choices
Yeah.
and make sure they align with our values.
Exactly. And speaking of consequences, one of Lane's most striking arguments is about the evolution of the nervous system. He doesn't just say that animals feel pain, he goes into the why.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. How does evolution play into this?
Well, he explains that pain is like a product of evolution, a vital mechanism for survival. So by tracing the development of a central nervous system through different species, he shows how pain perception is rooted in our shared biological heritage.
So he's grounding his argument in science. It's not just about feelings or projecting human qualities onto animals.
Exactly. He's showing that the ability to feel pain isn't just some human thing, but a fundamental aspect of many complex life forms. And this understanding has direct implications for how we treat those life forms.
It's a really compelling argument. I mean, if we accept that animals experience pain in a way that's biologically similar to us, it becomes harder to justify inflicting it on them unnecessarily.
It challenges that traditional hierarchy that
Yeah.
we've built between humans and other animals, a hierarchy that often puts human needs and desires above all else.
And that brings us to the core of the moral dilemma, doesn't it? If we acknowledge that animals can feel pain, and we have alternatives to using them for food or research, what does that say about the choices we're making?
It forces us to really confront the reasons behind our actions. Is it convenience, tradition, taste? Are those reasons strong enough when we consider the potential suffering of another being?
Those are tough questions to answer. And I think that's what Lane is trying to do with his writing. Make us ask those tough questions.
He's not necessarily trying to give us all the answers, but to start a conversation, to encourage a more conscious and compassionate approach to our interactions with other species.
And that brings us back to his comparison between eating meat and the Holocaust. While it's a sensitive analogy, I can kind of see where he's coming from now.
Right, he's highlighting the dangers of complacency, accepting things as they are without questioning the ethical implications. Just like people during the Holocaust may have ignored the suffering around them, he's suggesting that we might be doing the same thing when it comes to factory farming and the meat industry.
So it's about waking up to the reality of those systems, confronting the potential harm that can happen when we choose to ignore the experiences of others.
He's urging us to break through those mental barriers, those ingrained habits and societal norms that let us eat meat without really acknowledging the animal it came from.
You know, it's funny. I remember when I was a kid, I had this moment where I suddenly realized that the chicken on my plate was like the birds I saw at the park. It was unsettling.
That's exactly the kind of realization Lane is trying to evoke. He wants us to see the face behind the food, to understand that this piece of meat was once a living, breathing creature with its own experiences.
And it's not just about visualizing it. He uses those graphic descriptions, those thought experiments, to really drive the point home.
It's about making us feel it, not just understand it intellectually. He wants us to experience, even if just for a moment, the discomfort, the unease that comes with confronting the reality of our food choices.
He seems to be saying that this discomfort is necessary, that it can be a catalyst for change.
Exactly. He's challenging us to move beyond our comfort zones, to expand our empathy, to really consider the consequences of our actions.
It's a powerful message, and it's resonating with me more and more as we go deeper into his arguments. But he doesn't just focus on the big picture, does he? He also addresses those everyday contradictions we encounter.
You're talking about the whole pets versus livestock thing.
Exactly. Like, why are we horrified at the thought of eating a dog or a cat? But it's totally normal to eat a cow or a pig.
It's a great point. Lane says this distinction is mostly arbitrary, a product of cultural conditioning, not any real difference in the animals themselves.
It really makes you think. He's pushing us to question those deeply ingrained assumptions about which animals deserve our compassion and which ones are just commodities.
It goes back to that idea of expanding our circle of compassion. He's saying our empathy shouldn't be limited by species or cultural norms. We need to recognize the inherent worth of all living beings, whether we think they're cute and cuddly or not.
It's a challenging perspective, but it's hard to ignore once you start really thinking about it. He makes a strong case for reevaluating our relationship with animals and the choices we make that affect their lives. This deep dive is giving me a lot to think about. Should we keep going?
Absolutely. There's still more to unpack in Lane's arguments, and I think it's worth exploring how he responds to some of the criticisms of his views.
You know, it's funny how we use language to like distance ourselves from the whole eating animals thing we talk about. Pork and beef, not the pig or the cow it came from.
It's like Lane says we've built this linguistic shield to protect ourselves from the ethical stuff. We don't want to think about the animal behind it, so we use these sanitized terms that hide the connection.
It's kind of like how people used to talk about slaves as property. By taking away their personhood through language, it became easier to justify exploiting them.
Wow, that's a powerful analogy. And Lane's saying we're doing something similar with animals today, turning them into commodities so we can ignore their suffering.
He has this one line, don't eat anything that had a mother. It's so simple, but it really hits you. Suddenly, you're not just thinking about a piece of meat. You're thinking about a living being that had a life of family experiences.
Yeah, it makes you acknowledge their individuality, their inherent worth beyond just being useful to us. It challenges that whole human-centered worldview.
And Lane makes it clear that he's not saying animal life is more important than human life.
Right, like with that reader who was upset about the Holocaust comparison, Lane said valuing animal life doesn't take away from human life. It's about expanding our compassion, not shrinking it.
So he's not advocating for putting animals above humans. He's talking about a more inclusive way of thinking ethically, where we recognize that all living beings are interconnected.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that our actions have consequences, not just for us, but for everything around us.
Lane's arguments really do make you question a lot of things we take for granted. It's like peeling back layers to see a bigger, more complicated picture.
And that's what makes his work so engaging. He's not just giving us a diet plan, he's inviting us to look inward, to examine our values and how they match up with what we do.
So where do we go from here? If Lane's got you thinking, what's the next step?
Well, I think the first step is awareness. We need to learn about where our food comes from, the impact of our choices on animals and the environment.
There's so much information out there about plant-based diets, ethical food choices, animal welfare, and it's not about being perfect. It's about making progress. Even small changes can have an impact.
Absolutely. Maybe try a new vegetarian recipe every week. Or cut back on how much meat you eat in general. Support local farms that treat animals well. Every step towards a more conscious and compassionate life is a step in the right direction.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's challenged me and opened my eyes to new ways of seeing things.
That's what's great about these deep dives. They're not about giving us all the answers. They're about sparking curiosity, encouraging critical thinking, inspiring us to live more consciously.
So next time you're having a meal, take a second to think about how that food got to your plate. Think about how we're all connected and the choices we make that affect the world around us. And maybe, just maybe, Lane's message will resonate with you like it did with us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.